Hello everyone. In the last two videos, we have discussed about the matter related to why the Britishers have left India so quickly and so suddenly, and followed by the another question which was related to could the partition of India have been avoided or not? And since we are doing this series, today I'm going to discuss another important question related to India and India's independence struggle and its impact on the entire world. Issues which are often skipped in the textbooks. Today we're going to discuss about the issue related to the biggest political miscalculations. I repeat, biggest political miscalculations that happened before the India's independence. Let me start with a time frame because that will give a context. Between 1946 and 1947, in the span of just a few months, a series of political decisions actually changed the lives of hundreds of millions of people forever. This is not the story of one catastrophic mistake. It is a story of several miscalculations, if I could say, several political miscalculations. Some were made in London, some in New Delhi, some inside the palaces of the so-called India's princely rulers, and others behind the closed doors of a boundary commission who was drawing the lines on a map. In this commentary, we will examine 7 of the most consequential political decisions made before India's independence. By using, again, the British cabinet papers, the official correspondence, the work of historians who have spent decades studying archives on both sides of the partition, and certainly, I'll use the transfer of power document. This is not a story of a single villain. This is a story of about decisions and the consequences those decisions actually unleashed. Well, every political decision has a context. Some were made under extraordinary pressure, and some were based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. Others collapsed because leaders misunderstood one another, or I would simply say that they failed to communicate clearly. Our goal is not to judge the people who are involved. Instead, we are going to ask a simpler question. A simpler question, and that is, what did policymakers know at the time? And why did they choose the path they did? Because looking back with a hindsight is the most easy job. But understanding the uncertainties in real time is much harder. That's exactly what we are going to do. Let me start with 16th May 1946. So on 16th May 1946, the British Cabinet Mission unveiled what many historians regard as the final and realistic opportunity to preserve a united India. I've already mentioned that the proposals of the cabinet mission was very, very ambitious. Because instead of dividing British India into 2 separate countries, it envisioned one sovereign union with a limited central government responsible only for the defense, foreign powers, and communications. And everything else would remain largely under the control of the provinces. To address the Muslim League's concerns, the provisions would also be organized into 3 regional groups, giving the Muslim majority region significant autonomy. Enough of autonomy, and the Britishers hoped that this would remove the demand for a separate state called Pakistan. Well, remarkably, both major political parties initially accepted the cabinet mission plan. The Muslim League formally approved it on 6th June 1946, and so did Indian National Congress on 24th of June. And for a brief moment, it appeared that the partition of India might actually be avoided. But unfortunately, that optimism lasted only for a few weeks, because on 10th of July 1946, a press conference in Bombay, Jawaharlal Nehru made a statement. He made a statement that would fundamentally alter the political atmosphere. He argued that the proposed provincial grouping was not permanently binding, and the future Constituent Assembly would remain free to modify or even discard that arrangement. Well, if you see this from a Congress's perspective, this reflected its interpretation of the cabinet mission plan and its constitutional flexibility. But on the contrary, if you look this from the Muslim League's perspective, the statement sounded like something very different. To the Muslim League leaders, the compulsory grouping of the provinces was the central guarantee that protected Muslim majority regions within a united India. It was perhaps the sole reason why they actually approved the plan. Now, if that guarantee could later be changed by the Congress-dominated Constituent Assembly, then perhaps the entire arrangement no longer seemed trustworthy. I believe this was the first real miscalculation. This is where the real miscalculation lies. Because there is no convincing evidence that Nehru intended to deceive the Muslim League. Well, his remarks appears to have been an attempt to clarify what he believed was a genuine constitutional ambiguity. But unfortunately, in politics, intentions matter less than the perceptions. And this is a very, very strong sentiment. And in July 1946, the trust between the two sides, that is the Congress and the Muslim League, was already dangerously fragile. A legal clarification, a simple legal clarification was interpreted as a political betrayal. The timing could not have been worse. The fragile consensus collapsed. On 29th of June 1946, the Muslim League officially withdrew its acceptance of the cabinet mission plan. What many historians described as the last viable constitutional framework for a united India had actually fallen apart. Not because of a single dramatic event, but because both sides interpreted the same agreement in fundamentally different ways. Some histories doesn't change because of a war. Sometimes it changes because of a press conference too. Now, the collapse of the cabinet mission plan marked a turning point, and there is no doubt about it. It was perhaps the constitutional negotiations that had failed. The trust between the Congress and the Muslim League had nearly disappeared, and now the political struggle was moving beyond conference rooms, and it went on to the streets. Because on 16th of August 1946, Muslim League called for what it described as the Direct Action Day. And the purpose, according to the League, was to demonstrate the determination of Indian Muslims to secure a separate homeland called Pakistan. In Bengal, where the Muslim League headed the provincial government under the Chief Minister Hussain Shahid Sohrawardi, the day was described as a public holiday. A public holiday so that it allowed supporters to participate in a mass demonstration. The expectation was a powerful political show of muscle, show of strength. What followed instead was one of the bloodiest episodes in the final years of the British rule. Because within hours, the communal tension erupted across Calcutta, and what began as a political mobilization that quickly spiraled into a long-scale sectarian violence. For several days, the Hindus and the Muslims were attacked, one another, in different parts of the city. Neighborhoods became a battleground. Shops were burned, homes were looted, ordinary civilians, many of whom had no role in politics whatsoever, were caught in the violence. And by the time the order was gradually restored, thousands of people have been killed. Thousands. And many more, actually, have been injured or been displaced. Now, historians continue to debate the exact consequences of the events and the responsibility of different actors, but there is one broad agreement on a point, and that is that the provincial administration, headed by the Muslim League, responded far too slowly and perhaps with a purpose. Because police intervention proved inadequate. The military deployment was very, very delayed. And by the time security forces regained control, violence had already spread beyond anyone's ability to contain it. This was perhaps the second major political miscalculations. Because the Muslim League appears to have underestimated how rapidly a political demonstration could descend into an uncontrollable communal violence. Well, at the same time, the provincial Muslim League government dramatically overestimated their own ability to maintain the law and order once the tension erupted. Well, neither assumption survived when confronted with the reality. And the Calcutta wasn't the end. The violence triggered a chain of reaction across British India. In the months that followed, communal riots spread to Naukhali, to Bihar, to Garmukteshwar, and eventually to Punjab. Each new outbreak deepened the fear. Each act of violence fueled the demands for retaliation everywhere. And with very passing week, the possibility of a peaceful political settlement became increasingly remote. By the late 1946, many leaders on all sides had begun reaching a grim conclusion that if communities no longer believed they could live together peacefully, then perhaps partition was no longer just a political demand. Perhaps in their eyes, it had become inevitable. And this was the most unfortunate consequence of this miscalculation. If Direct Action Day shattered the trust between the two communities, the events of the 1947 would expose an even deeper failure. Because as partition became unavoidable, the British believed they had prepared a force capable of preventing mass violence. On paper, it looked sufficient, but in reality, it collapsed almost immediately. Now, coming to the third miscalculation, and I quote it as the Punjab boundary force. Well, by the summers of 1947, the British officials knew that Punjab was the most dangerous region in the subcontinent. Because unlike Bengal, Punjab wasn't simply divided by politics. It was divided by geography. It was divided by religion. and demography, all at the same time. Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, they lived across the provinces in an intricate patchwork of towns and villages. There was no clan, there was no clean line that could separate them. The British intelligence report repeatedly warned that once partition was announced, Punjab could descend into a mass violence. And to prevent that from happening, a special military formation was created, and this was called the Punjab Boundary Force. Well, on paper it looked formidable, because nearly 25 battalions comprising 50,000 troops all were placed under the command of Major General T.W. Rees. Its mission was straightforward: maintain law and order, protect civilians, and ensure a peaceful transfer of power as millions found themselves on the opposite sides of a brand new international boundary. But the force contained a fatal weakness. Many of its soldiers have been recruited locally, and when communal violence erupted, many found themselves protecting or confronting their own communities. The assumption had been that professional army discipline would overweigh personal loyalties. Well, in many cases, the assumption proved unrealistic, but as the violence intensified, neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain. Some units simply became ineffective, while others struggled to carry out orders in between the chaos. The force that had been created to prevent violence was itself overwhelmed by it. Yet this wasn't the only miscalculation. An equally serious problem lay with the border itself. The new boundary had already been determined. Ratcliffe had completed its final award on 12th of August 1947, but the British government under Lord Mountbatten decided not to publish the boundary immediately. He decided not to publish the boundary report immediately. Instead, the decision was withheld till 17th of August, 2 days after the India and Pakistan had already become independent nations. Well, the intention, according to the later explanation, was to avoid overshadowing celebrations of independence. In practice, the delay created enormous confusion. It created enormous confusion. Millions of people celebrated independence without knowing which country they actually belonged to. Imagine the pain and the uncertainty. This was completely because of the colonial rules, colonial policies, and their ill intentions and frivolous justifications. The district officials didn't know which government they would serve. The police forces were uncertain about their jurisdictions. The military commanders, they lacked clarity over the exact line they were expected to defend. And the countless ordinary families had no idea whether their home would ultimately fall inside India or in Pakistan. And in such situations, rumors spread faster than facts. Panic replaced certainty. An entire community began fleeing based on speculation rather than official information. By the time Ratcliffe Award was finally made public, the largest migration in modern history had begun, and the Punjab Boundary Force already stretched beyond its limits, and they could no longer contain the violence. Within weeks, I repeat, within weeks, the force itself was dissolved. What had been designed as the security backbone of partition had actually failed. Years later, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad questioned the extraordinary haste with which the power had been transferred. Now, if the arrangements were not ready by 15th of August, he asked, why to rush forward anyways? It was a question history continues to debate, because sometimes history is not shaped only by the decisions that leaders make. It is also shaped by the information that they deliberately chose to delay. Now, when the Britain announced the 3rd June plan in 1947, in which they actually preponed the transfer of power by almost 10 months, the future of the British India became clear. But there was one enormous question that remained unanswered, and that was related to what would happen to the 556 princely states. These kingdoms were not directly governed by the British Raj. Instead, they existed under the system known as the British paramountcy, a network of treaties through which Britain controlled their defense and foreign affairs while allowing their rulers to govern internally. Now, with independence approaching, British declared their paramountcy would simply cease to exist. And from that moment, every Maharaja, Nawab, rulers would have to make one of the most consequential decisions in their state's history. And that is whether to join India or Pakistan or attempt to remain independent. For most states, the decision came surprisingly quickly through an extraordinary diplomatic campaign led by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and his constitutional advisor V.P. Menon. The overwhelming majority agreed to accede in India, accede to India within weeks. But not every negotiation went according to the plan. And in several cases, miscalculations nearly changed the political map of South Asia. Let me start with the first one. The first involved the princely states of Jodhpur. Its younger ruler, Maharaja Hanwant Singh, was initially attracted by Pakistan's offer. According to several historical accounts, Jinnah presented him with what has often been described as the blank sheet of paper bearing his signature, inviting the Maharaja to write down whatever terms he wanted in exchange for accession. Now, the offer reportedly included privileged access to the port of Karachi, an attractive proposition for a landlocked kingdom. Now, it was an extraordinary negotiation tactic by Jinnah, but it also reflected a significant political gamble. Before an agreement could be finalized, Patel personally intervened. Rather than relying on pressure alone, he offered Jodhpur more practical guarantees within the Indian Union. In the end, Hanwant Singh reversed his course, and Jodhpur eventually joined India. Now, a second case unfolded very differently. It was Junagadh, a princely state which is ruled by a Muslim Nawab, but nearly 80% of its population was Hindu. Despite its geography, it was surrounded by Indian territory. The Nawab chose to accede to Pakistan. The decision stunned both Indian leaders and many local residents. India responded by restricting the state's land and economic connections. As internal unrest intensified, the Nawab fled to Pakistan, and in February 1948, a plebiscite was held in Junagadh. And of course, the result was overwhelming. An overwhelming majority voted in favor of joining India. And then came the most complicated case of all of them. That was Hyderabad. Well, let me put it this way. Now, when we're discussing about Hyderabad, unlike many other princely states, Hyderabad was enormous. It had its own army, it had its own currency, own administrative system. The Nizam, Osman Ali Khan, believed that his state could survive as an independent country after British withdrawal. It was a very ambitious vision, but it underestimated the geographical realities of the subcontinent. Because Hyderabad is located at the very center of India. An independent conclave surrounded on every side by Indian territory posed a serious strategic and geopolitical concern for the new Indian government. And therefore, negotiations began. And not only that, the negotiations actually continued for more than a year. And unfortunately, neither side was willing to concede. And eventually, in September 1948, India launched what it is officially called as a police action. A police action. And within days, Hyderabad surrendered and joined the Indian Union. Now, if you see, each of these stories are different, but they share a common thread. And that was that some rulers overestimated their bargaining power, and others believed promises made during negotiations could be sustained indefinitely. And in several cases, leaders simply ran out of time because in 1947, history was moving much faster. I would say much faster than diplomacy. Well, now I'm coming to discuss the fifth political miscalculation. This is a topic which is even debated today. This is a location which is often been in news, particularly in the Western countries. It has become an international issue since last almost 60-70 years. I'm talking about the story of Kashmir and the cost of waiting. Well, of all the princely states facing a decision in 1947, none would leave a longer shadow over South Asian history than Jammu and Kashmir. Unlike many other rulers, Maharaja Hari Singh strongly refused to make an immediate choice. He did not want to join India and also not ready to join Pakistan either. His preferred option was something entirely different. It was independence. Well, on paper, the idea was not impossible. However, with its strategic location, its natural resources, and a long history as a princely state, Kashmir's rulers believed that the kingdom might survive as an independent buffer between the two new dominion, that is India and Pakistan. But history rarely gives leaders unlimited time. As British India disappeared in August 1947, events on the ground began moving very, very fast, much faster than Maharaja's diplomacy. To maintain the normal trade and communication, Kashmir actually signed a standstill agreement with Pakistan. India, however, did not conclude a similar agreement, preferring further discussion before accepting one. And for a brief period, the arrangements appeared to preserve the status quo. But beneath the surface, the situation was steadily deteriorating. The communal tensions intensified in parts of Poonch and Jammu. Political unrest grew rapidly. The economic disruptions increased, and every week that passed made neutrality harder, extremely harder to sustain. And then came the October 1947, when the crisis reached its breaking point. Thousands of tribal fighters from Pakistan's northwestern frontier province, supported by the local elements, according to many historian accounts, crossed into Kashmir and rapidly moving towards Srinagar. That's the capital. Along the way, towns were overrun, communications collapsed, panic spread across the valley. The Maharaja suddenly faced the very scenario where he had hoped to avoid, which he had hoped to avoid. Now, as the invasion advanced, Hari Singh abandoned Srinagar and left and fled to Jammu. There, he confronted a harsh political reality. The government of India made its position very clear since the beginning, that without a formal instrument of accession, India could not legally send its army to Kashmir. The time for postponing a decision had actually run out. On 26th of October 1947, Maharaja Hari Singh actually signed the instrument of accession and formally acceded Jammu and Kashmir to India. And when I say acceding Jammu and Kashmir to India, I mean the entire Jammu and Kashmir to India. So therefore, when today India calls that the entire Jammu and Kashmir is and will be an integral part of India, it is based on the instrument of accession, which was signed on 26th of October 1947 by the Maharaja Hari Singh himself. And there should not be any doubt regarding its authority and its origin. Well, the following day after the signing of the instrument of accession, the Indian army and its troops were airlifted into Srinagar in one of the largest emergency military action of its time. They succeeded in preventing the capital from falling, and within weeks, the immediate advance of the tribal forces had been halted. But by then, the conflict had already transformed. Large parts of the states remained outside Indian control. The war actually expanded, and the dispute reached to United Nations. And here I would like to point out in a very subtle way that the dispute certainly reached United Nations, but it reached because Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, he actually took the matter to the United Nations. And eventually there was a ceasefire that froze the battleground rather than resolving the issue. Had Nehru avoided reaching out to United Nations, Indian army would have taken the entire Jammu and Kashmir. And today, we wouldn't have been witnessing so much of bloodshed and chaos in Kashmir. So if somebody blames this to Congress, if somebody blames Nehru for this, well, I genuinely believe that even the supporters of Nehru would not escape this kind of blunders. They would not be able to justify such blunders. And when the LOC or the line was created by that conflict, it was known as the line of control, which remains one of the world's most heavily militarized frontier. Even today, historians also continue to debate another question connected to Kashmir. It was the Radcliffe Award. The Radcliffe Award that placed the district of Gurdaspur inside India, providing the new Indian state with a land route into Kashmir. Some historians have argued that this decision may have influenced India's ability to intervene militarily, while others reject that interpretation, pointing out that no conclusive documentary evidence has ever been proven political interference in Radcliffe's decision. The debate continues even today, but the evidence remains inconclusive. What is less disputed is the Maharaja's own delay. By waiting until the military intervention became unavoidable, he actually surrendered the ability to renegotiate its position, its earlier position of stability, of remaining independent. His decisions was eventually made, but it was made under the pressure of invasion and not through a careful diplomacy. And sometimes waiting too long becomes a decision in itself. This is what I personally believe, especially after reading the documents. That belief system actually got cemented. Well, let's come to the sixth political miscalculation, according to me. Looking back at every major decisions that we have so far covered, you will find a striking pattern begins to emerge. And the problem was not always the decision themselves. Often, it was the failure to communicate those decisions clearly, consistently, and at the right moment. Again and again, critical information either arrived too late or was interpreted in completely different ways by the people who were receiving it. For example, Jawaharlal Nehru's press conference in July 1946. The words hadn't changed. From Congress's perspective, his remarks reflected a constitutional interpretation of the cabinet mission plan. From the Muslim League's perspective, they sounded like an announcement that the agreement itself could be rewritten after its acceptance. Well, the words hadn't changed, but the meanings had. And that difference proved political catastrophic. Well, you will find the same pattern appeared a year later when Radcliffe completed the boundary between India and Pakistan on 12th of August 1947. The maps were ready. But the people whose lives were dependent on those maps had no idea where the border actually lay. The district officials didn't know which country they would administer. Families trying to decide whether to leave or to stay relied not on official announcement but on rumors, whispers, word of mouth. Stories carried by frightened travelers. One rumor would empty an entire village overnight. Another could send thousands of people rushing towards railway station, even when no official evacuation had been announced. In an age before television, before mobile phones, even before satellite communications, information traveled unevenly. Fear traveled much, much faster. This wasn't simply an administrative failure. It was a structural challenge. The British Empire was attempting one of the largest transfers of political power in modern history. Across a subcontinent of nearly 400 million people, using the communication infrastructure of the 1940s. Railways were overloaded. Telegram networks were stretched beyond its capacity. Local administrations were themselves in transition, and every institution responsible for maintaining order was simultaneously being divided between two newly independent states. Just imagine. It was an almost impossible task, but secrecy and haste made it even harder. The delayed publication of the Radcliffe Award, the uncertainty surrounding local administration, and the absence of reliable public communication created an information vacuum. And history has shown time and again that information vacuums are rarely filled with facts, but they are filled with fear. By August 1947, millions of people were simply fleeing violence. Many were fleeing uncertainty itself, because when no one knows where tomorrow's borders will be, every rumor begins to feel like the truth. By the beginning of 1947, Britain knew it had to leave India. The question was no longer whether independence would happen. It was actually about how. And that exact moment, another unexpected decision changed everything. The British government replaced the man leading the transition, and a new viceroy arrived, and a dramatically shorter timetable. Now, one final political miscalculation receives far less attention than it deserves. It wasn't made in Delhi or Lahore or Calcutta, rather it was made in London. In the final months of the British rule, the man responsible for managing India's transition was not Mountbatten. This is what we have been told in school textbooks. The man actually who was behind this transition, or rather who was managing this India's transition, was Field Marshal Archibald Wavell. Unlike his successor, Wavell believed that forcing a rapid political settlement carried enormous risk. As negotiations between Congress and Muslim League repeatedly broke down, he began developing what became known as the breakdown plan. The idea was very straightforward. If India's political leadership failed to reach an agreement, Britain would withdraw gradually, region by region, instead of transferring power all at once. Well, the proposal wasn't ideal. It acknowledged that constitutional negotiations might fail. But Wavell believed that a phased withdrawal would give administrators, security forces, and provincial government more time to prepare for the transition. Well, London disagreed to it. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government feared that Wavell's approach would require Britain to maintain a large military presence in India, and that too for a much longer time. And especially after the devastation of the Second World War, Britain was exhausted financially, politically, militarily, and I would say morally too. The government wanted a quicker exit. In December 1946, Attlee decided to replace Wavell. A few months later, in March 1947, Lord Mountbatten arrived in India as the last viceroy. He inherited one of the most complex political crises in modern history. But he also inherited something else, as possibly a short deadline. Well, initially, the government in Britain expected the power to be transferred by June 1948, whereas Mountbatten dramatically accelerated the timetable. Instead of another year, Britain would leave in just 5 months. Well, supporters of this decision argued that delaying independence would simply have prolonged uncertainty and increased violence. On the other side, the critics argued the opposite. They contend that compressing such an enormous political transition into a matter of months would left little time for administration, for preparation, security planning, or an orderly transfer of power. Well, the debate continues even today. But here is an important detail that is often overlooked. The rush towards partition wasn't driven by Mountbatten alone. By late 1946 and early 1947, the senior Congress leaders had already begun accepting that partition might be unavoidable. Historical records indicate that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and VP Menon had already begun drafting their own ideas for the partition before Mountbatten even arrived in Delhi. In other words, the momentum towards the division was already building. Mountbatten accelerated the process, and he didn't create it for nothing. And this distinction matters because history is rarely shaped by one individual act. More often, it is shaped by multiple leaders responding to the same crisis, each believing that their decision is the least dangerous option available. Well, to conclude the entire commentary, I would say that these 7 political miscalculations, all unfolding within little more than a year, each decision, viewed in isolation, had its own logic. Some leaders were trying to secure the best possible future for their communities. Others believed that speed was preferable to prolonged uncertainty. Some delayed difficult choices, while others acted too quickly. None of them, I repeat, none of them could fully foresee the chain reaction that would follow. But when all of those decisions collided, their combined consequences actually reshaped the history of South Asia. Partition triggered one of the largest human migration in recorded history. Millions, I repeat, millions of people crossed newly drawn borders, and hundreds of thousands lost their lives. Communities that had lived alongside one another for generations were suddenly divided by an international frontier. And the question left unresolved in 1947, most notably Kashmir, which continues to influence regional politics nearly 8 decades later. Perhaps that's the most important lesson the story offers. History's greatest tragedies are rarely caused by a single villain or a single catastrophic mistake. More often, they emerge from a series of understandable human decisions, each one made with incomplete information and each one appearing reasonable to someone at that time, until together they produce consequences that no one originally intended. That's the sad and harsh reality. And that's why studying history matters, not to assign blame, but to understand how nation or other nations arrive at moments that change the world forever. Thank you so much.